Jack.
Oh, great. I want to emphasize how difficult a paper like this was to put together. Although it is very beautifully written and easy to read and has wonderful felicities on every page, interesting things, this actually took an enormous amount of work. And this is a wonderful paper, and it really deserves wide recognition. I want to talk a little bit about some ideas that came out of thinking about the paper, as I've read it in several versions before. And the place I'll start is by talking about the idea of translation as paraphrase. And this idea actually has a long history. If you go back to Scripture, what you discover is that the Israelites, or the people living in Judea and Israel, eventually no longer spoke Hebrew, and so they had Targumim, which were paraphrases, translations into Aramaic. And the Targum became extremely important for prayer service because they would read the Torah in Hebrew and then they would read the Targum, which was in Aramaic, so people could understand it. And eventually the Targum become important interpretive text. So in other words, if there is by the time you get to the compilation of the Mishnah and the Gemara, you would sometimes look at the Targum in Aramaic to get a figure of what the Hebrew is, because you have to remember, at this point, Hebrew is just a scholarly language. It's no longer a commonplace language you use. So the relationship between paraphrase and translation goes very, very deep. Also, Targum turns out to mean both translate, to paraphrase, and to explain. And as you can see, one of the interesting features of these translations is that they're trying both sometimes to paraphrase and also to explain. And that is a way of understanding lots of texts that arise contemporaneous with a canonical text like the Constitution. So many of you, especially those of you who have worked on the Second Amendment, know about the Blackstone Commentary by St. George Tucker, which is based on work he was doing in the 1790s and is finally published around 1803. And that is a paraphrase of substantial parts of the Constitution. Later on, of course, you get Story's commentaries, which are as much a paraphrase of Marshall's opinions as they are of the Constitution sometimes. But anyway, these are examples of people using paraphrase as a method of giving an account or an explanation of what's going on. The thing that's interesting about paraphrases as a kind of translation is that paraphrases tend to reflect the problems, the concrete problems people are facing at the time when the paraphrase is made, as opposed to more general problems that may arise later. In other words, people imagine what the scene of the problem is, and possibly they imagine future problems, but those are bounded by their time, and so the paraphrase often reflects that boundedness, and so that's very interesting when you think about it. Another thing that these translations paraphrase do, as you can often see in the discussion of what a felony is, or in the discussion of arts and sciences or commerce, examples that Christina gives, is that these paraphrases become opportunities for comparative etymology. What I mean by that is this: often the translators use cognates from different languages. The cognates, however, have different histories. They diverge from each other, and as they diverge, they pick up different connotations and ideas, and then you bring them back together and you compare them. It's often very interesting what happens. But also, some of them come from Latin, etc. But the other thing that's interesting is that the way language usually grows is it grows by metaphorical or analogical extension. So that when you see these words being chosen, the choice of one word rather than another brings with it a complete different set of metaphorical extensions and analogical extensions which have entailments which matter for law. So in the commerce discussion, you have a bunch of different words that are used to describe commerce. Each of them has a different analogical and metaphorical history. Each of them takes you in a slightly different place. This is really, in my view, why it's so interesting to read such a paper. How many times?
No, I was taking it away. So
all right. How many minutes do I have left?
You have more than 5.
All right, 5, so that's all I need. One of the reasons it's really interesting about this paper is that it shows you what we might call the latent ambiguities and the latent vaguenesses, not the same thing, in a canonical text at the time of its adoption. A text may have latent ambiguities at the time of its adoption, which are not apparent to the people who draft it. But as others attempt to paraphrase it, right, translate it or paraphrase it, these ambiguities become latent. I should explain, this is different than a latent vagueness, right, which is just a feature of a certain choice of concept. But a latent ambiguity is a genuine ambiguity as to which concept is being referred to. And you can see this in some of the examples that Christina offers. You have, we didn't even realize there was a problem until somebody tried to paraphrase it. It occurs in the context of the recess appointments clause, for example, in which they pick one way of doing the recess appointments clause, but not the other. But both of them would be plausible ways of cashing it out. And that suggests that the ambiguity is present not later on, but during the moment in which the canonical text is exacted. Now, the reason why that's important is for a fact about the role that history plays in construing original meaning. Yogi Berra has a very famous saying. He says, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And that is to say, you've got to do something, so take the fork in the road. And the interesting thing about the recess appointments clause and the treatment that Christina has here is she shows that at the time that the clause is adopted, there's actually a fork in the road. That is to say, there's a latent ambiguity in the clause that is revealed by the translator's attempt to try to paraphrase it. And then, of course, they don't adopt the view that the recess of the sentence refers to one. It's that when the sentence is absent. But that's just one possible rendering of the ambiguity. It's not the only one, certainly. But the very fact that the translation takes a fork in the road, that is, it goes one direction or another, suggests that there is a latent ambiguity, and it's one that you basically have to fight out. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important to distinguish between latent ambiguities that arise later in history and latent ambiguities that occur at the time the canonical text is composed. Larry Lessig, who also has written on translation, but also on law and technology, has pointed out that technological change may reveal latent ambiguities in a text, but those ambiguities arise because of the interaction of the text with the future, right? That is, there's new technology and it creates an ambiguity. But we're here interested in a different problem than Lessig. This is the latent ambiguity that exists at the time the canonical text is written and is exposed by attempts of different folks in the community to paraphrase it. Why is that important for originalists? It's important because the role of what history can do. One of the most important things about originalism is to understand what history can do for us and what it really can't do for us. How far it will take us and how far we have to go the rest of the way ourselves. A latent ambiguity from today, produced by the interaction of the text with the future, that is, a latent ambiguity from today's perspective, can be remedied through additional historical research. We just do better history. We may disagree, but the idea is we can remedy that latent ambiguity simply by doing better history. But a latent ambiguity that existed at the time of adoption cannot be remedied through better history because there just is a latent ambiguity at the time of adoption. It can't, no matter how good historians we are, we can't resolve that simply through history. We'll have to do something else. We might draw, as Mike Rappaport and John McGinnis have suggested, on original legal methods to resolve the ambiguity. We might engage in what Larry Solomon calls construction. Right? But in other words, there's something here that there's so far we can get with history, and so far we have to do something else. And that is why, in some sense, studying translations of a document contemporaneous with its construction are so interesting, because they reveal to us the possibility of latent ambiguities at the time that we might not know about. That is, we could see there's an ambiguity today, but the real question is, was it ambiguous at the moment it was produced? Two more things. What I've got? 1 minute left? Okay, fine. I have a student, Kristen Buemiller, who is working on a slightly different problem, but I think it's a total kick. She points out that many of the people who adopt the Constitution, especially in the Committee of Detail, Committee of Style, were classically educated, and that if you look at the way the Constitution is phrased, it is mimicking Latin and Greek grammar. That is, the way the sentences are construction are actually Latin and Greek, and she has basically doing a paper for me now trying to figure out how their attempt to model these rhetorical forms that they learned in their early education affects the way in which we understand what the Constitution means or meant to the audience at the time, so stay tuned.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jack. Now, first trio is Jeff Podjanowski, Fred Schauer, and Thomas Colby.
She want to respond to Jeff?
Oh, of course she does. Sorry.
No, so just two quick thoughts. The recess lines, for those who didn't get to that part of the paper, the German one is neat. It paraphrases to when the Senate is not sitting, which sounds potentially problematic, except the root word of sit could mean both sort of sitting in that meeting or in session in a very broader sense. So it preserves the ambiguity as they go over. The Dutch is translates to during the absence of the Senate, but the particular use of the word absence is a word that was only used in the context of princes and diplomats going away for 2 years. Right, so during the truly extended absence of the Senate, where we don't expect to hear from him because he's in Italy for a long time. And so that really tracks quite closely to the majority opinion in Noel Canning, even though it does not explain or give any credit to the definite article in The Recess, right? So that's all I want to say about that.